All right. So hello and welcome to everyone who's here to NADSN's Emerging Ideas Series. Today's panel is called Perspectives on the Arctic, and we'll cover research on key Arctic defense and security interests and priorities of several non-Arctic states and how these relate to Canadian policy. In terms of the structure of our program today, I'm going to begin by introducing each of our speakers with a brief bio, and then I'll turn it over to them for their presentation. Each panelist will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, during which time I'd really encourage you to put questions in the Zoom chat, either directly to me or to the general audience, and I'm happy to pose those at the end of the Q&A period. The Q&A period will take place after everyone has spoken, so just as to be aware of that. We will wrap up for sure by 1:30 p.m. as we've got 4 speakers today, and we want to make sure we give enough time for questions. The main presentations are being recorded, so this has been, the recording has already started, but the recording will not be in place for the Q&A session. So without any further ado, our first panelist is Dr. Ryan Dean. He is currently an assistant professor with the School of Public Policy and Governance program at St. Francis Xavier University, where he also teaches political science. He's currently a network coordinator with NADSN, having served previously as NADSN's research and policy coordinator and its postdoctoral fellow at the School for the Study of Canada at Trent University. Dr. Dean received his PhD in political science at the University of Calgary in 2022, with the completion of an award-winning dissertation examining how societal actors have influenced the formulation of Canadian Arctic security policy. His recent edited volumes include Shielding North America, Canada's Role in NORAD Modernization with Dr. Nancy Teeple, and Canada and the Origins of the Arctic Council, Key Documents from 1988 to 1998 with Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer. Our second panelist is Nicole Covey. Nicole is a PhD candidate at Trent University and holds a Shirk Mines Doctoral Award. Nicole is the ELN lead here at NADSN and is a fellow at NADSN, CGAI, and Triple Helix. Her research is focused on Arctic geopolitics, Canadian foreign policy, NATO, and NORAD. Our third panelist is Trym Eiterjord. Trym is a PhD student in geography at UBC. His research focuses on Arctic foreign policy making in Asia, the relationship between science, technology, and polar geopolitics, as well as the production of Arctic expertise. He is a predoctoral fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science and a research associate at the Arctic Institute, which is a DC-based think tank on Arctic security issues. He has experience working in the Norwegian Foreign Service, holds a double BA in Anthropology and China Studies, and is an MA in Chinese Politics from the University of Oslo. Our fourth panelist, and finally, is Kate E. Todd. Kate is a graduate fellow with NADSN, a Master's of Public Policy student at the University of Toronto, and a naval warfare officer in the Royal Canadian Navy Reserves. She is also a fellow with the Policy Insights Forum, Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and regularly comments on and publishes about defense and security issues affecting Canada. Her research centers around maritime and national security in the Canadian Arctic, infrastructure development, and Indigenous rights. Most recently, Kate has been working on a report about the Royal Canadian Navy's past, present, and future in the Arctic, which will be published very soon through NADSN. So with all that said, I will thank our panelists for joining us today, and I will pass it over to our first speaker, Dr. Dean, to begin.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Dr. Ryan Dean, and I'd like to thank Nicole Covey and Nicholas Gillespie for inviting me to present to the Emerging Leaders Node my work on the United Kingdom and the Arctic, which I've just put in the chat. Thank you also for organizing this event. Greetings, fellow panelists, and thank you, Joanne, for moderating. Today's presentation is a welcome break from marking the various comparative public policy papers, presentations, and exam I'm working my way through by my wonderful students at SaneFX. Since I have my public policy hat on, I will try to keep my remarks clear and concise, taking not much more than 10 minutes of time and opening space for questions for the panel. To give you some context, D&D Paul, or ADM Paul, asked NADSN to do some work this past spring on various Arctic policies, most notably a review of the policy frameworks of the Arctic states and those non-Arctic states like the United Kingdom, the Arctic's nearest neighbor, that have interest in notable capabilities to contribute there. As the then NADSN Research and Policy Coordinator, I drafted this UK brief as a template for others to work from in writing their own contributions. Since this was a written brief for a D&D audience, I will focus these remarks accordingly. I think the major strength of the UK brief I wrote is its review of past UK policy, putting their most recent Arctic framework looking north, the United Kingdom, and the Arctic into context. It tells the story of a modern UK policy towards the Arctic, beginning a decade ago as being controlled largely by their Foreign Office and oriented around human security and driven by climate change. And this policy has shifted to one increasingly shaped by the Ministry of Defense and oriented around confronting Russian air and maritime forces in the high North and North Atlantic, and driven more by geopolitics. First, I want to offer some observations and comments about this decade of British policy development and what we Arctic states can learn from it. I was struck by the clarity of the UK policy. While my brief focused on the 2023 policy framework looking north, I researched the previous two UK policies, 2018's Beyond the Ice and 2013's Adapting to Change. And that was the first Arctic white paper published by a non-Arctic state. All three of these policies provided clear priority areas for the UK to pursue in the Arctic. They are not trying to be all things to all people, but made increasingly hard choices about where and how the UK would devote its energies towards the region. And these policies were all self-referential to each other, and the various reports by the House of Lords and the ministries that helped to inform them. And this clarity made it very easy for me to trace the development of UK policy over time, to present the story to you that I hopefully did in my NADSN policy brief. It demonstrated who was providing input when, on what, and this made it easier to chart both change and continuity over time. And it gives transparency and accessibility, perhaps even legitimacy, to a policy that doesn't require much inside ball knowledge by the reader to contextualize and comprehend. This showing their homework is lacking with some of the other Arctic policies by the Arctic states, and I think a best practice they can adopt as they continue to formulate their own. Next, the confidence I read in the UK policy really stood out to me. I had mentioned this to several academics and policymakers, and they all made the point that the UK is a former great power that used to run the world's largest empire. And this created a strategic culture that persists to this day, one that tackles the big geopolitical questions and places the UK as an active agent in that mix rather than a passive observer that must suffer what it must. I appreciate that most Arctic states are not great powers nor have that legacy, but it was refreshing to read about a state that actively seeks to promote the rules-based international order with a level of ambition that went beyond trying to carve out a niche role in doing so. This confidence is most reflected in the various leadership opportunities the UK has sought for itself. This includes its Northern Triangle defense contact with Norway and the United States, and leading the Joint Expeditionary Force comprised of the Nordic countries, as well as the Northern Group consisting of Denmark, I wrote this down, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Sweden. And it's even currently building a standing response force built around a littoral response group. I understand that many Arctic states have limited military capabilities to devote towards this region, but it was refreshing to see a country that was prudently building these forces in response to a multipolar world increasingly marked by strategic competition. I think this is something Canada can learn from. Lastly, despite the Arctic being a relatively low priority for the UK's 2021 national security strategy, the country does write and revise policy often regarding the region. And here's a quick aside. I should mention that as a Canadian, I'm somewhat envious of the UK's capability to produce such a document. I know we tried over 15 years ago with less than stellar results and have never attempted another go of it. Okay, anyways, returning to the UK, they've demonstrated a lot of policy learning over this past decade of writing and writing often. For example, the 2023 2013 policy framework was built upon Dr. Rob Hubert's thinning ice thesis, which was already over a decade old at that point. Furthermore, the supporting terminology within that framework was a little clunky for Arctic audiences. And I should concede maybe this is me having read it with the benefit of 2020 hindsight. But anyways, in contrast, the UK's recent policies and reports are far more specific about Russian action in Ukraine and elsewhere driving their Arctic politics. And it's shown a lot of flexibility in adapting to this development. Additionally, the language in the 23 policy framework was far more calibrated for Arctic audiences. UK policy learning in the Arctic serves as a good example for other Arctic states to write and write often, as to not be left behind in shaping the region. The UK's 2023 policy framework ultimately premises its engagement with Canada as, quote, learning from its expertise as an Arctic nation. And I think these three observations of clarity, confidence, and writing often are things Canada and others can learn from the UK. The UK demonstrates that there's still plenty of space for policy entrepreneurship in the Arctic as the region is increasingly integrated into the larger international system. And Canadians have shown in the past this entrepreneurship in the late 1980s and the 1990s, for example, in shaping the Arctic. And comparing the UK policy with our own brought to my mind several avenues for doing this again going forward. First, how do we conceptualize the Arctic? The UK does not have any territory in the circumpolar north on which to anchor its notion of Arctic. It focuses on the waters and airspace running from the Greenland-Iceland UK gap towards the high north of the Bering Sea in Norway. The Arctic is adjacent to this. In comparison, Canadians' notions of the Arctic are very much North American. There's a big gap between the North American and European Arctics that could be bridged. I don't mean to return to an older, holistic one Arctic conceptualization, but ways in which we can link British strategies towards defending the high north with what should be Canadian concerns about defending North America. Can these links be made more explainable and accessible to both populations? Now, the hard power of UK strategy is designed to confront Russia in the high north. It's meant to deter them with a focus on preventing them from mucking about with undersea defense infrastructure, for example. If tensions do escalate into open conflict, the UK aims to do two things. First, it's going to confront those Russian maritime forces, which are mostly a submarine threat, and the supporting air and aerospace threats from reaching up from that high north through that Greenland-Iceland UK gap into the sea line communications in the North Atlantic. And this is where the UK brings important capabilities to the table. It's got nuclear-powered submarines, it's got aircraft carriers, and it's got significant maritime patrol capabilities it can devote to this anti-submarine warfare demand. And UK forces are going to try to persist in this high north, which the Russians consider their bastion defense, and anti-access area denial military strategy designed to control who gets in to that space in the event of a shooting war. If the British can survive in that environment, the second thing they aim to do is land troops in the northern Norway to help defend that area from possibly being captured or attacked by the Russians and enhancing their anti-access, area denial capability across the region. And the UK rhetoric is that it's the Arctic nearest neighbor. But from a defense perspective, it's very much on the doorstep of this high north gateway for Russia into the Atlantic and for NATO into the Russian Arctic. And how can we better explain this to Canadians? I mentioned NATO because the alliance is finding its mission in the Arctic, and this should be explained to its populations. Reading the UK policy framework and its supporting documentation really got me thinking about this. I think a lot of people still very much have this Cold War mentality towards the Arctic, rooted in NATO protects Europe, with things like the US Maritime Strategy, or even, dare I say, the Canadian Air Sea Transportable Brigade Group, or CAS, being sent to Norway. But all that was kind of a sideshow to the big battle in Germany if war were ever to break out. And, you know, in North America, NORAD would try and deter and defend the continent. It's all sort of disjointed coalition warfare. I'm not suggesting that there's a new Cold War. For example, Russia has very different intentions and capabilities from the old Soviet Union. But maybe we can put together a more cohesive explanation about how the defense of the high north benefits the defense of North America to Canadians and vice versa for the British. This is something that UK policy demonstrates the British to be good at. I point out in the NADSN policy brief that there's numerous exchange options for the British and Canadians to work with each other in their respective Arctics to help foster this common explanation. To simplify things, the British can come to Canada to train in Arctic conditions that exceed what they can expect in the high north. And Canadians can go and participate in British initiatives, assuming our military still has that bandwidth for that high north point of view. And my hope is that this training across the Arctic will help make our militaries more effective and better build that common perspective that links the defense of Canada and our Arctic to the UK's high north and better explain that to Canadians. Lastly, I wanted to address the concern flagged in the brief about the UK's aim of upholding the rules-based international order, possibly conflicting with historic Canadian waters across the Northwest Passage. I thought it prudent to point out that the UK seems to have jettisoned customary law on which Canadian sovereignty over the passage rests from their interpretations of the law of the sea. The UK interpretation of the law of the sea is presented solely as the statutory law spelt out in UNCLOS. This means the UK would not be open to the historic title argument Canada has. However, I do not think this is a major challenge and we shouldn't fixate on it. UK policies are oriented around Russia and China, messing with the law of the sea in the Arctic and elsewhere rather than Canada. And their policies, they very much name names and Canada is not mentioned. Here again, I think we should take a page from British policy and keep the Northwest Passage proportionate to the grander strategic picture and have confidence in ourselves that were this potential disagreement to ever flare up, we could see it off. To wrap up, from a defense and security perspective, the British are really aiming themselves at the Russians in the high north. Over the past decade, they've written some accessible policy that clearly tells the story. Perhaps we can learn from them in updating our own story about how the Arctic factors into the defense of Canada and the larger rules-based international order from which we greatly benefit. And a big component of this is linking the North American Arctic to the European high north, from NORAD to NATO, so to speak. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the following presentations and to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for that interesting presentation. We certainly appreciate it. I will pass the speaker microphone over to Nicole. Over to you, Nicole.
Okay, just 1 second while I share my screen. Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you, Joanne, for moderating this panel today. My name's Nicole, and I'm excited to share a policy brief I wrote this past spring on the Republic of Korea, also known as South Korea or ROK, and their position in the Arctic, and the potential areas for conflict and cooperation with Canada. So, ROK has been a predictable Arctic partner since it achieved observer status in the Arctic Council in 2013. The state has achieved a reputation as being an incredibly active and diligent participant in the Council's working groups. The current vision that ROK has in the Arctic is to be a pioneer and partner in shaping the Arctic future. Their stated policy goals are to promote participation in Arctic economies, increase participation in Arctic governance, and contribute to the international community and build capacity for addressing challenges in the Arctic. The ROK's first Arctic policy was released in 2013, and it's notable for being one of the first non-Arctic state national Arctic policies, and was designed to guide ROK's actions from 2013 to 2017, highlighting 3 issues the state really wanted to focus on: international cooperation, investing in new business, and focusing on polar scientific research. ROK appointed its first Arctic Affairs ambassador in 2015, and also undertook a pilot navigation of an Arctic Sea route by a Korean shipping company. In 2017, Korea's Ship Owners Association joined the Arctic Economic Council, and the 9 Bridges strategy was proposed. A presidential committee on the Northern Economic Cooperation was also established this year. 2018 brought along the second Arctic policy that the state produced, as well as the 2050 polar vision, which kind of highlighted the state's goals through both polar regions through 2050. In 2019, ROK ratified the Central Arctic Oceans Fisheries Agreement. When we're looking at the 2050 polar vision, everything that they say is very much in line with the Government of Canada's priorities of the Arctic, and there's no immediate points of concern. They simply underscored the importance of climate change, technological advancement, and scientific research in its longer-term plan for both polar regions. In both the government and academic literature, which, by the way, is incredibly sparse, a major reason why the ROK has been so active in the Arctic is the expected economic potential they're hoping to get from the region. There are many ways that they're hoping to gain economic benefit, such as through resource extraction, lowering the costs of transits via Arctic shipping routes, and the increased demand for ROK's shipbuilding expertise. ROK understands the region to be one of economic potential and a theater in which to grow the country's international profile. ROK is extremely interested in polar shipping and shipbuilding, and they've placed an emphasis on the Northern Sea route. And its intense interest in the Northern Sea route is one of the reasons why ROK's Arctic strategies have so strongly targeted Russia as its primary Arctic partner. Due to ROK's status as a world leader in shipping and shipping technology, the state's push into this sector of Arctic development is significant. ROK is hoping to further develop an industry specializing in Arctic navigation technology, specifically surrounding the various icebreakers, tankers, and icebreaking technologies. Thus, ROK has a strong invested interest in ensuring that all the northern passages stay open and accessible to the international community. They are very eager for potential shipping routes that would allow Korean companies to get goods to the European market quicker, cheaper, and safer when compared to traditional shipping routes. ROK has been using the Northern Sea route since 2009, with a high degree of success and increasing number of voyages being conducted. ROK has signaled it not only wants to be involved in the area of polar shipping, but they want to become an industry leader. Now, when we're looking at ROK in Canada, it's important to realize that both states share close relations and have established diplomatic ties in a variety of areas. For example, Canada's first and only bilateral free trade agreement in the Indo-Pacific region is the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement. In terms of trade, ROK is Canada's 7th largest trading partner and 6th largest import and export partner. While Canada does not identify ROK specifically in its Arctic documents, the state is singled out in the Indo-Pacific strategy, which identifies ROK as a partner for Canada due to sharing strong strategic interests and bilateral relations. The Canada-Korea Comprehensive Strategic Partnership was established in September 2022 and was based on 5 shared priorities: human rights, environment and sustainability, climate change, defense and security, economic prosperity, and lastly, health and culture. And this year, the 2 states have celebrated their 60th anniversary of established diplomatic ties. So, while the ROK is not mentioned directly in either Strong, Secure, Engaged or Canada's Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, there are several areas of opportunity that could be fostered between the 2 countries. As noted in the Canada's Arctic Northern Policy Framework, Canada wants to enhance bilateral cooperation with Arctic and key non-Arctic states and actors. ROK is a key non-Arctic partner due to their record of embracing Arctic multilateralism, the commitment to Arctic scientific research, existing ties to Canada, and like-minded values. ROK would benefit Canada by providing a trusted source for world-class shipbuilding and at the same time furthering economic cooperation between the 2 states. ROK has repeatedly demonstrated its desire for multilateral diplomacy in the Arctic, both inside and outside the Arctic Council. And they have invested both time and energy into Northern scientific research and have repeatedly stated their desire to invest in Northern economic development. And thus it stands that cooperation between ROK and Canada in these areas would not only fulfill domestic policy goals for both nations, but bring ROK closer to the Western states. Now, there are two big areas of divergence or potential concern in regards to ROK's Arctic activity for Canada. First, the primarily articulated partner for ROK in the Arctic is Russia. Russia is mentioned in all their Arctic documents and in the Nine Bridges Project, which was a cooperation project between ROK and Russia in the north. And Canada is not named as a potential partner in any of ROK's documents, Arctic documents, sorry. But after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, ROK has taken several steps back from cooperating with Russia, despite the strong economic ties the two countries share. In fact, ROK has become closer to NATO and the Western democracies over this conflict, thereby diminishing, at least in the short term, this area of concern for Canada. ROK has openly sided with NATO, imposed sanctions on Russia, provided aid, and sent weapons via third parties to Ukraine. After these actions, Russia declared ROK an unfriendly state, which is a major break between these two states. As ROK was Russia's second largest Asian trading partner, China was number one, and their eighth largest partner overall. Second, and now the most prominent area of divergence and or potential concern comes from ROK's willingness to work outside the Arctic Council. They explain it's due to the limited role that non-Arctic states have in the forum, sorry. ROK spearheaded and is the most active member of the Asian Arctic Club, most clearly demonstrated in the established trilateral high-level dialogue on the Arctic, made up of ROK, China, and Japan. The idea that ROK or another non-Arctic state could create its own Arctic forum that may end up competing with the Arctic Council in the future, be it in having divergent interests for the region, or possibly ignoring the rights of Northern Indigenous peoples, is a serious and pressing concern for states like Canada, who value these things and have also made their preference known that they want to keep the Arctic Council and Arctic governance small. The state also ROK explicitly acknowledges the need to work with Indigenous peoples in all its Arctic documents, and it also acknowledges the legitimacy of the Arctic Council. But ROK has demonstrated its willingness to create other arrangements when its interests are not being met. And this is a concern that's repeatedly brought up in the literature and is a serious concern for the government of Canada. My brief concluded with the idea that the Republic of Korea has demonstrated its interest in the Arctic region. They want to be involved. And they focused on two main overarching priorities: economic interest and international diplomacy via the Global Korea Strategy. ROK has repeatedly recognized the inherent sovereignty of the littoral states in its Arctic policy and the fact that it needs to cooperate with Northern Indigenous peoples. While ROK has historically looked to Russia as its principal Arctic littoral partner due to geography and the infrastructure the state has along the Northern Sea route, Canada should seize this opportunity to actively pursue opportunities to collaborate with the state, as the two have demonstrated that they are like-minded states, share like-minded values, and have pre-existing economic and diplomatic ties. And that should continue into the Arctic. And that's my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nicole, for your commentary. I will now pass the speaking microphone over to Trym. So please feel free to go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Joanne, and thank you to the other panelists. I will talk about Chinese perspectives on the Arctic and review sort of their Arctic policy. But I want to go a little bit off the cuff based on what both Ryan and Nicole have said in terms of, especially what Ryan mentioned about policy learning. It kind of sparked a an idea in my head in terms of how we think about Chinese perspectives on the Arctic and its Arctic policy. But just to do kind of a quick recap first, China's only policy document remains this 2018 Arctic Policy White Paper that was put together by sort of a range of Arctic experts in China and published by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it sort of sets out 4 pillars of what China's interests and sort of activities in the Arctic are. And I think I don't have the English translation right here, but it's mainly first to sort of deepen exploration and understanding of the Arctic. So scientific research, both when it comes to climate research, environmental research, but also research sort of more directed towards developing resources in the Arctic, which is another aspect of their policy. And the second is environmental protection, or protecting the eco-environment of the Arctic, as they say, and sort of more actively on a policy level address climate change, both as it's happening in the Arctic, but also, or from the Chinese perspective, these more sort of teleconnected consequences of Arctic warming at more southern latitudes in China. And the third is to utilize Arctic resources, and they emphasize in a lawful and rational manner. So sort of taking part in resource management, developing resources. And this is mainly shipping, so making use of and developing shipping routes, primarily the Northern Sea Route or the Northeast Passage, and also natural resources, both offshore resources, but so far mainly onshore. So hydrocarbon, for example, in the Russian Arctic, or as we've seen with several Chinese state-owned companies who've shown interest in mining projects in the Canadian Arctic or in Greenland, for example. And the last pillar, I think, is their goal to participate actively in Arctic governance. So just to take part in Arctic governance. The Arctic Council is a big focus, but also other mechanisms and other fora. For example, this recently ratified moratorium on fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean, and the Polar Code. So in the National Maritime Organization, and mechanisms like that. Another sort of key thing about the Arctic policy, which whoever's been sort of following China's sort of Arctic activities for a bit will know, is that they declare themselves as a near Arctic state. And this term, which they sort of justify by saying that they're one of the countries that border or have their border as like close to the Arctic. So I mean, they border to the north, they border Russia, and you have the Sea of Japan, and then you have the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait. So that makes it geographically a near Arctic state, but also the effect of climate change, or Arctic warming on its territories, but this term sort of became a lightning rod for a lot of controversy. It's from Arctic governments, from analysts, pundits, media, where it was sort of framed that China had this revisionist ambitions in the Arctic, whether it was to, kind of what people go for, unilaterally go for resources, for example, in the Arctic high seas area, or try to develop or affect sort of Arctic governance, for example, outside of the Arctic Council. And all of this was sort of encapsulated in this term, near Arctic state. And I think following the release of this Arctic policy in 2018, you've seen a fairly big pushback from Arctic governments. It was especially the US under the Trump administration, but also other Arctic governments, both sort of diplomatically in the Arctic, but also more on a security level, thinking more about what sort of China's ambitions in the Arctic are, and how they might be tied into, for example, their research program or investments in infrastructure, state-owned companies who might be present or might be interested in projects in the Arctic. But this sort of use of the near Arctic term and kind of all the negative kind of publicity that gave makes this policy kind of on a public relations level, and a PR level, kind of a failure. Because obviously this is a policy document that is meant to present, just like Nicole mentioned with Korea's policies, Arctic policies, Arctic policy documents, present their intentions and interests towards primarily the Arctic states, but also the international community as a whole. And just simply using this term near Arctic state was a big misstep. And I think following the release of this policy paper, there's been obviously a realization domestically that this was not wrongly worded necessarily, but it was they could have gone for a different wording, for example. They could have presented this in different ways. And some of this comes down to basically a lack of, well, I wouldn't say a lack of understanding of Arctic politics, for example, or how a non-Arctic state is supposed to identify itself, as for example, an Arctic stakeholder versus an Arctic state. But maybe also simply a lack of exposure to Arctic politics from its own policymaking community. And this is why I think about this point that Ryan raised in the UK context of policy learning. So we only have this one policy document from China, and there's very little or almost no insight into how these policies are formed. And also we don't really know how the learning process after these policies are sort of taking shape. So it's difficult to kind of understand to what extent, for example, China is refocusing its Arctic interest now, or developing its Arctic policy, and that kind of speaks to the difficulty of speaking on its perspectives in the Arctic. But yeah, so sorry, I just lost my But so what I wanted to present initially was just this changing kind of interest in the Arctic post the Arctic policy, and we could also say post-COVID, we could also say post-war in Ukraine, in the sense that these are all three events that I think have drastically changed how it views its own involvement in the Arctic. During the period of its Arctic policy in 2018, there was a big push domestically for many of you have maybe heard of the Polar Silk Road. Polar Silk Road, and this larger kind of globe-spanning Belt and Road initiative. And there was a big sort of very ambitious idea of that both Chinese capital, Chinese technology, Chinese companies, and also they would use the term Chinese wisdom or kind of some sort of Chinese expertise could have a big positive impact on governance and development in regions around the world, and the Polar Silk Road specifically was directed towards the Arctic. That the pushback that followed the release of the policy and the way these ideas about the Polar Silk Road or being in the Arctic state have been received, I think has really made, to the extent that Beijing thinks about the Arctic, has made them kind of go back to the drawing board a little bit and realize that it might be wiser to sort of take a step back and kind of think more of themselves in terms of a contributor to Arctic governance on the same line as, well, any other country. Ryan mentioned in the opening about great powers, and sort of China definitely sees itself as a great power, that it doesn't really have the political capital or cachet in the Arctic to act that way. So it's we've seen this now. I was at the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik just 2 months ago, where the Chinese participants definitely seemed more keen on sort of coming back to this more, multilateral way of thinking in terms of the Arctic, and there's less interest in promoting distinctly Chinese initiatives, for example, or taking too much of a lead, or showing playing too much of a role in Arctic governance, and sort of kind of roll back a little bit their own kind of position in the Arctic, take a smaller role. I'm wondering, sorry, I'm wondering if maybe we can, if there are questions later, I can kind of go more deeper into these issues, and because I've lost track of time, and if we want to go over to the next speaker. But thank you.
Thank you, Trym. No problem. We can certainly come back to that in the question period. That would be great. Over to you, Kate, for your presentation. I'll just get you on Spotlight here and ask you to unmute yourself. Perfect.
All right, thank you so much. And just checking, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. My name is Kate Todd, and I'm a graduate research fellow with the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network. So today I'll be presenting to you about the Netherlands in the Arctic. I want to thank Nicole, Nick, Joanne for moderating, Ryan and Nadsen for this opportunity. It extends from some research I was doing this spring that Ryan mentioned when Nadsen commissioned reports on several non-Arctic states, including the Netherlands. I wrote a policy brief that was published in July about the Netherlands' defense and security interests in the Arctic, highlighting some areas where Canada and the Netherlands have similar and disparate priorities. Although my research on Arctic security issues primarily revolves around domestic Canadian issues, this was a great opportunity to investigate how Canada can advance its goals while cooperating with allies. My presentation today will give you some background about the Netherlands as an Arctic actor, summarize what my research goals were in writing my policy brief on the Netherlands, go over what policies I reviewed as part of my research, identify the Netherlands' Arctic defense and security priorities, compare them to Canada's interests, talk about what areas I think Canada and the Netherlands have divergent interests in, and share some ideas I have about how Canada and the Netherlands can work together to advance their goals. To situate those of us who aren't as familiar with the geography of Europe and the Arctic, I've included a map on the bottom right-hand corner here of where the Netherlands is in Europe. So to clarify, the Netherlands is not an Arctic state, but has been an active observer state in the Arctic Council since 1998, which is the leading intergovernmental forum promoting cooperation in the Arctic. The Netherlands is located on the North Sea and has a strong historical connection to the Arctic. For centuries, the Netherlands has been interested in trade routes through the Arctic and has been economically reliant on overseas trade. In 1594, Dutch explorer Willem Barents, the namesake of the Barents Sea, began his expedition in search of a northern passage there. Today, the Netherlands' interest in the Arctic continues to be centered around trade and economic development, as well as climate change, which directly affects the Netherlands via rising sea levels and changes in biodiversity and economic opportunities in the region. When researching the Netherlands this spring, I had three main questions that I wanted to answer. The first is, what are the Netherlands' key defense and security interests in the Arctic? The second is, what are areas of opportunity and common interest that Canada has with the Netherlands? And the third was, what are areas of divergence and concern? To answer these, I reviewed the Netherlands and Canada's Arctic and defense strategies and policies, as well as the limited academic literature on the topic. The Netherlands has released 4 polar strategies since 2009, and they have been using sort of what Ryan was mentioning, these iterative processes to develop more strategic insights into what their Arctic goals are. And I think that this is something that Canada could also start leaning on instead of only publishing about once a decade. So their 4 strategies have acted as guiding frameworks for the Netherlands' actions and investments in the Arctic, and have mainly focused on their polar research program and cooperating with the international community to achieve shared research goals that they believe will help improve the environment and help them in economic development in the area. The most recent strategy was published in March 2021, entitled The Netherlands Polar Strategy 2021 to 2025, Prepared for Change. This document details the importance of the polar regions for the Netherlands and highlights climate change, safety, and security as areas of concern for the country, as well as sustainable economic activity. This strategy is quite different than previous strategies, as it directly addresses the Netherlands' security interests in the Arctic and reiterates what's said in the Netherlands' 2019 defense doctrine about the importance of maintaining political stability in the region. Previous to this, strategies had focused mainly on scientific research, and the 2016 strategy started touching on how geopolitical competition was rising in the area and potential issues that might bring. But the 2021 strategy was the first that actually said that there are security issues that the Netherlands wants to address. So in the Netherlands Defense Doctrine, Defense Vision 2035 policy, and security strategy, the country also highlights the potential for conflict in the Arctic over access to and control of shipping routes, and the importance of its membership in NATO in addressing potential threats in the Arctic, but assesses overall that the risk of conflict in the Arctic is unlikely in the next 15 years. So according to the Netherlands' most recent polar strategy, the country has 3 priorities in the Arctic: protecting natural habitats and the environment, strengthening international cooperation, and ensuring sustainable economic activity. When comparing the Netherlands and Canada's interests in the Arctic, the main takeaway I want you to have is that many of the 2 countries' interests overlap. Climate change is affecting both countries, and environmental research and protection is vital to meeting the 2 countries' environmental commitments and economic goals. Both countries rely on international cooperation to meet their scientific research and defense and security related objectives. Both countries have also signed on to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and are trying to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which both support the environment and Indigenous rights. However, the main difference between the 2 states' interests are that Canada is focused on its own national sovereignty in the Arctic and protecting that via the military as an instrument of foreign policy. And the Netherlands benefits from and is supportive of developments in the Northern Sea route. So I'll dive a little bit deeper into the 2 areas of divergence that I just mentioned. So Canada is interested in and committed to being able to defend its sovereignty in the Arctic as an Arctic state. The government is making major investments to improve its situational awareness in the Arctic, enhance Canadian Armed Forces presence in the region, develop surveillance technology for the Arctic with the United States, and conduct joint exercises with Arctic allies and partners, including NATO. The Netherlands Polar Strategy and Defense Papers demonstrate no such military focus in the Arctic, aside from reiterating that the country is part of NATO and willing to respond to threats in the NATO treaty area. The new Netherlands Polar Strategy does mention that they have security interests, but not being an Arctic state, they don't actually have any forward planning on how they would get involved militarily other than through NATO. So aside from that, the Netherlands benefits from and is supportive of developments in the Northern Sea route. The route would benefit the Netherlands economically due to increased trade through the port of Rotterdam with China and Russia. Canada, however, has noted concern about China's use of the Northern Sea route as part of their Polar Silk Road, and sees trade with China or Russia as supporting those regimes' violations of human rights and aggression against other states. However, as I was saying on the slide, which compared the Netherlands and Canada's interests, the 2 countries share many common goals. These create opportunities for the countries to work together to continue investing in environmental research that aims to promote sustainable economic development across the Arctic, implement the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and support the rules-based international order and cooperation in the Arctic, as well as ensuring that both countries are able to effectively respond to emergencies in the Arctic, such as search and rescue incidents. The last point I wanted to emphasize in particular, because it's noted in Canada's strong, secure, engaged defense policy, Arctic and Northern policy framework, as well as the documents in the Netherlands, that there is an interest to work with allies to ensure that the countries are able to respond to emergencies at sea and in the Arctic region. By working together, I think that the Netherlands and Canada can support their economic, environmental, safety, and security interests in the Arctic. If you'd like to read my full policy brief about the Netherlands in the Arctic, I have this QR code here, and a big thank you to Nick for also putting the link to the policy brief in the chat. And if you'd like to connect with me, I've included my email and LinkedIn profile information here because I'm always open and excited to speaking to people who are also interested in Arctic and maritime defense and security issues. So thank you again to NADSN for the opportunity to present to you today, and thank you all for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kate, for that, and to all of our speakers for their very engaging presentations. I'm going to stop the recording now because we are about to head into